today I'm going to show you how to make some quick adjustments to a single stock photo to make a cover for your books. So I'm going to go in Photoshop, and this is Photoshop CC 2017. Anything from CS6 and up should work, so you should be good with that if you have Photoshop. And a lot of this stuff you can also do in GIMP. So I'm going to open one of my presets for a Kindle cover, and I typically make my covers at 3200 pixels by 4800 pixels at 300 ppi, and that seems to be a good size to either size it up or shrink it down as needed. So I've got my blank canvas here, and I'm going to bring in a single stock photo that I want to use to make this cover. And I did that by opening the folder with the photos that I have and just simply dragging it in. Or actually I have it in already. Let me enter that and do that again so I can show you. Alright, and you hit enter. Now from here, this is definitely not the size we want it to be. I can Control plus and Control minus zoom to see my cover, how I would want it to fit, and I definitely want to make this bigger. So Control T will transform and put these little transform nodes around the picture, and if I hold the Shift key, I can make it about the size that I want it to be. Now with this photo, because she's holding a sword, I want that to be part of the picture, but you'll see that up above and down below it's going to be cut off. So I'm going to make it about the size that I'd like, and then I'll show you how to use the clone tool to make that filled in up and below. So that's about a decent size here, and what I'm going to do next is grab the clone tool, and this menu will probably be over on your left side of your screen. I like to use it on the right because I'm on a tablet and I'm right-handed, so it's really easy access for me here. I'm going to create a new layer by hitting the little new layer button down the lower right hand corner, and I'm going to set my clone tool to current and below, so that'll catch my current layer here and everything below it. So with my Alt key, I will grab part of the background of this photo, and I'm using a standard big fuzzy brush. It's one of the brushes that'll come in Photoshop. It's just big and round and fuzzy, and you can pretty much make it with a round brush, turning the hardness all the way down to 0. So I'm going to adjust my brush size there, and then I'll start bringing this color up into the top here. And yeah, sometimes you'll get hard edges, and you can just smooth those over. So with this photo, this is pretty easy because it's all a similar tone here. Sometimes when you have more detail, it gets a little trickier and you need to take more time on it. But there's also ways you can kind of smooth that around by darkening the top too, and I'll show you how to do that later. So you want to check for any spots that would be uniform, like right here you can see that the clouds are a little similar. So I'm just going to go through and grab some of this color and smooth that out. And then down below, this is a little trickier. Here I'm going to need to zoom in And what I'll do, there's a little bit of a cheat you can do with this once we start putting on the text, but right now I'm going to line it up right about where it would be and then just start getting the color in. So this doesn't need to be super precise on the first try. And whenever you need to pick a new color spot, you just hit the Alt key, click, it'll grab that color, and then you can go down here and use that color to fill in your background. And it will make a lot of repeating patterns just because you're covering the patterns to begin with, but you can go back through and smooth those out. So I'm just bringing in, and here I'm going to erase. Whoops, my eraser is not on high opacity. I'm going to erase just parts of this and go back again with the clone tool to get more of that background in there. And we'll get this area down here. Sometimes you want to use a bigger brush for the clone tool, sometimes a smaller one actually works better. Right here I'm using something that's maybe medium. Now I have a few edges that I need to clean up, and I also want to make sure that this edge down here is going to be straight. So I'm actually going to make a new layer, and this is a nice straight edge right here. What I'm going to do is take this and clone that out right there. And then I'll zoom in. And there's several ways you can erase this with a really sharp line. I either make my eraser very small and do it by hand, but I'm on a tablet too, so that I can do that by hand. And if you are going to be doing design like this a lot, I would highly recommend getting a graphic tablet. Something like a Wacom Draw would work for just beginning, or Intuos is another one. I'm going to go in this layer below. Intuos is another one that would give you more pressure sensitivity. Alright, so I need to clean up this little spot here. So on this upper layer, I'm going to get another clone stamp here, and I'm going to make my brush pretty small to make this a harder edge. Just so I get a nice edge going down. Alright, so this is not super precise. There's still some patterns going on, but there's a trick with this. You'll be able to cover up a lot of this with text and with darkening, so you don't need to be super precise if you don't have the time, if you're not quite sure how to do that. So if you want to, you definitely can, but if you're not sure, you can let it go for putting the text in. So from here, we have a pretty decent composition. I'm thinking the title will probably go down in the lower third, and the author name could likely go in the top, and or vice versa on this one. Typically you have the top portion and the bottom portion as either title, author, and series name. But we really don't want to leave this just as it is. We want to put some adjustments on this to make it more tailored and just so it doesn't look like a generic stock photo. So the first thing I'm going to do is drop a texture on it. And you can get a lot of free textures online at sites like lostandtaken.com and also Pixabay. I'm going to go into a texture folder that I already have a lot of textures that I've downloaded before, and I'm just going to bring in one to start with. Now, when you drop in a texture like this, what I actually did to do that, I have a keyboard shortcut, but what I actually did was to go File, Place Linked, and that will place a linked object into the document window here. So I'm going to place it, I'm going to hold the Shift key so that it doesn't distort. And then I'm going to rotate it. And see, this texture has light on one side and dark on the other. So I'm going to want to determine where my light is. And it looks like on this one the light is coming from the left. So I'm actually going to rotate this so that the light is coming from the left. And I'm going to go to Edit, Transform, Flip Vertical so that it's coming from the top. Now once I have that texture in, I'm going to go to Layer Modes, and there's different layer modes you can use. Some work better for others for different textures, for different photos. You just kind of have to play around. One I use a lot is Overlay, and that's a little strong on the highest setting. So I'm going to go to the opacity slider and bring that back. So I have texture. It creates this nice kind of grittier feel, but it doesn't completely distort the picture. So without it and with the texture, it just adds this different kind of feel to it, and it actually changes the lighting just a little bit. So that'll help me get the feel and shape for what I'm going for here. Another thing I like to do is make a new layer over top of everything. And sometimes I put this above the texture, sometimes I put it below. Actually, this time I'm going to put it below because I want it to be picked up on the texture. And I'm going to go into my brush, and that's also B for brush. And I'm going to grab just a regular big fuzzy brush and turn that down to around 30% opacity. And you can also do that by hitting 30 on your keyboard. And I want to have black here, and I'll make it really big and kind of make my window smaller just so I can see everything of what's going on here. One thing you're definitely going to want to do is to zoom in and zoom out a lot to see what it looks like as a thumbnail. So I always have my fingers on the Control plus and Control minus buttons. So what I'm going to do with this is just swipe the corners. And see, it's starting to create this feel that centers her in the cover. A darker sky. And I don't always want that strong of an effect, so I'll go into my eraser and also change that to around 30% opacity. Make that a little bit bigger. Take out some of that dark edge there. So see how it kind of centers her in the composition. it starts really drawing the eye to where she is. Whoops, I did not mean to erase that. And sometimes you don't always want it that strong. Sometimes you might want to make another layer and do a little bit more darkening, and then take that and drop the opacity down. So it adds just a little bit more, but not too much. So with this composition, I'm looking at it and actually seeing she might look better with the whole image flipped horizontally, because that carries the eyesight from left to right. And I'll go in there and just kind of make any more adjustments, because your eye actually sees things differently from one angle to another. And I'm just going in and playing with the darkness here around the corners till I kind of get the feel for what I like. Now, there is light coming up here, and we see some of this with the texture, but I'd also like to put a little bit more highlights around her. This will help make her really pop in the scene, and I'll also lend more of an illustrated air to it versus just straight stock photo. So here what I'm going to do is create another layer. I'm going to put this below my two shadow vignette layers. I'm going to stay with my soft brush white, or stay with my soft brush, but change that to white and make it a lot smaller. Or first, actually, I'm going to create a highlight here. And this right now is just set to normal, but if I set that to overlay, it starts lightening that specific area. And I can come in here and sort of pick out more of a highlight. And sometimes, I'll show you, sometimes it can get too strong. It's a little too strong on her face. So I want to knock that opacity down. That really starts to make her stand out. And here's where I'll create another layer and then kind of make smaller patches of light. And I'll also change that to overlay. When it's on overlay, the light color will not pick up the dark, or the dark will not pick up the light. When it's on normal, see, you do see the light in there. And actually, you do want a little bit of that white on a normal layer. So with a smaller brush size, if you trace just a little bit over the line and a little bit over it, where you want your highlights to be, and your highlights would come in the direction that the light is. And in this one, it's coming from the upper right. So I just trace a little bit of highlights. And for this, that's a little too strong, so I'm going to move my opacity back. And actually, I don't want the highlight on the hair right there. So I'm going to erase that out. So with that highlight, it just brightens it a little bit to bring it more into a scene feel. Now those are just some really quick adjustments to the light and the shadow. Now let's do some image adjustments for really bringing out the contrast, the color. Right now, one of the adjustments that you can do to really bring out the contrast is a curves adjustment, and this is the panel that will come up with curves. And it looks a little scary. There's kind of a lot of controls here, and you can actually go in and do individual colors, which is more of an advanced technique, but you can get really nice contrast by pulling this part down just a little bit, this part up just a little bit. And see how that really darkens the shadows and brightens the whites. And I don't usually use that at 100%. I usually knock back the opacity on that just a little bit. And these are kind of really subtle adjustments, but they will really help you get a better feel to it, a more professional looking feel. So I have a curves layer. I'm also going to do, sometimes I like to do a solid color layer. Now this will just kind of come up and blank out what I'm doing here. With this kind of a layer, you can add a whole color over the scene, and it'll just change the look of the scene. And I often like to set this to either overlay or soft light, and definitely turn the opacity down. With yellow, it makes it very vintage looking. It just gives it a very different tone. And I can go in here, double click on the adjustment layer color, and go in and go through all these different colors just to see what really works for me. And this is something you'll probably play with a lot till you figure out what color you really like. And I'm going to tone this down more, but even toned down, it still pretty significantly changes the colors. So I have that, and now I'm also going to add a color balance layer. And again, this is kind of more of a complex control, but there are a few things you can do really quickly to actually give a piece more cinematic colors, which is a technique that's used to just get more of a intense feel. So I'm in the midtones right here, which is where it is when it first starts up. I'm going to bring more blue and cyan into my shadows, and I'm bringing more yellow and a little bit more red into my highlights to preserve her skin tone mainly. So if you see that up close, this is without it, and this is with just a little bit of color balance. And this is still feeling a little cool to me. I'd like to bring that a little bit warmer. So one other layer type that I like to use for adjustments is a photo filter. And I often just use the warm filter that comes up when it first comes up. There's many different types of filters in here. There's warming filters, different kinds of warming filters. Cooling filters, those are usually a little harsh. And then different colors that can give different effects. Like, I really like that orange here. It adds it adds over top of the colors you already have without completely messing up the contrast. So I have a decent color scheme that I like here. And we put in the vignette, we put in some extra highlights. So to do the text, I'm going to make sure that I'm on top of all of my other layers. And grab the text tool. I like to start with text as white, and then I'll go to other colors. And here I'm just going to type a title. which is not showing up because it is black. And actually it is very, very small. So with the text, a lot of times this is just default Photoshop font that comes up, or sometimes the last font you used. So I basically have just one text element here already. And I really definitely want to change that. So what I'm going to do is double click on the T icon for text, and I'm going to pull up the font Carrig, which is a really nice font. It's not free, but it's pretty decently priced for doing fantasy. Now I can go up here to my adjustment bar and click in the font size and use my up and down arrow keys to make that the size that I'd like. So I'm only doing one word here because I'd like to have the freedom to either, move it to one side or down below or straight up and down, sizing in between it. I can do that a lot easier if I have two separate words versus having two lines. So right here, I'm also going to make this all caps. You don't have to do that for a cover, but a lot of times it adds more weight to a title. And you do that by, in the text panel, hitting the double T. So I have that part. I'm going to drag this down, and if I hit Shift while I'm dragging the second layer down, it'll keep it directly in line with the layer up top. And I already have this lined on center, so it'll keep it centered. And here I'm going to type in the second line of the title. Now here's where it comes really in handy to have two separate layers. So I can duplicate this layer again, type what I would like to be in the center text, move that up here, and then with my transform, what I'm going to do is, this is centered right here, and I want it to stay centered, so I don't really want to shift click and drag in here. What I want to do is go up to the top, hit the link button to make sure that it stays the right ratio, and then I'll click in my 100% and use my down arrow to get it the size that I want. Now this is a really, really dumb title, but I think it'll work for this. And this is not even that great of a composition, but you can move things around when you have things in different elements like this, to zoom out and see what it looks like as a thumbnail, zoom back in again. To select several layers at a time, you can click on one, shift, and click on the bottom one, or hold down Control and click on each individual layer. And you can hit, or I always drag these down to the folder. There's keyboard shortcuts, but this is my workflow. But if you have it in a group, then you can move it all on its own. So I like how that looks. I'm going to make it bigger to give it more weight. And I'll often kind of go in and play with the sizes on these a lot. And sometimes, like here, that actually looks better turning off the caps. A lot of this is moving things around with the arrow keys just to see what you think works well. And I'm not 100% happy with that, but sometimes I actually take hours to figure out exactly where I want my titles to be, so I'm just going to let that be for now. So for the name up top, I'm going to just put in generic author name. And then I'll take my move tool and just scale that down and center it. And right now I'm just moving this around to where I'd like it to be. Now I'm probably going to add a series name down there, so I'm just going to put that text in. Make that smaller. Yeah, so this isn't super refined, but it'll do in a pinch. Now, we have composition. This is styling is close to epic fantasy, which is what I'm going for. And a really good trick to figure out what you actually want to be looking for when you're designing covers. I go on the Amazon bestseller lists, and I make these really big boards on Pinterest full of the stylings of each individual subgenre. Like this is a board I have for epic fantasy. And you can see a lot of these books have fonts that are similar to the font that I used here. Just very kind of, I think they're called Roman or Latin type fonts. Kind of basic, have more of a weight to them. And a lot of these compositions as well are similar. There's a little bit of texture here with a sword. There's kind of a monochromatic look to it, more one color versus many colors. So it just depends on what you're going for, but it really, really helps to have a visual overview of what the whole genre looks like. That way you can pick and choose what you like, what you're going for, and that'll help you figure out how you'd like your own book to look. So with this, I don't really like just the plain text. There are different text effects that you can get either free or you can buy them, and they will show up in your styles pane. I like to use a lot of metal effects, and these are just kind of, you're not sure what they're going to look like until you try them. And actually, I'm not sure I like the metal with this one. So I'm actually going to turn those off and go back in my history menu. I'll actually show you quickly how to make layer styles on your own. So I have my whole title in one group, and I'm going to make layer styles for just that title. So you double click on the group or the layer in Photoshop, and you can do this for any layer. And it opens up the layer style dialog. And the first thing I like to do is usually put in an outer glow. And I'm not keeping this glowing. I'm actually going to change the white to black and change the layer mode here from screen to multiply. And what I can do with this is, with the size slider, I can get this really nice shadow behind the text. And I can make it lighter or darker. I don't usually like to go too dark, just dark enough that it gives a little bit of dark behind it. And that's also usually not quite enough. So what I'll do is I'll make a layer right behind the text. Grab a big black fuzzy brush. Make sure it's like on 20 to 30% opacity. And then I'll make it just slightly bigger than my text. And if you hold down the Shift key and draw, it'll actually lay down your brush in a straight line. And I'll do that for each of these. Now that's a little strong, so I'm actually going to create a new layer. Do that again, and then really knock that back. So those shadows really help make the text stand out. And it also gives more weight down here to this part of the cover, so that your eye is drawn to the lighter parts up here, and also drawn to the text itself versus the blending of the background. And that's also a little strong over here, so sometimes I like to take my shadow layers, put them in a group, and I can add a layer mask to this group by clicking the layer mask button down here. Taking my brush, making sure it's on black, which will subtract what I have down, and then just carefully kind of smoothing some of that away. And you'll see it shows up on here. That's my layer mask here. I can hit Shift and click that to see what it looks like with the mask or without the mask. And also, if you like your mask but you don't like how strong the mask is, you can go in here in the properties panel and drag that back to how dense you would like your mask to be. I'll zoom in here so you can see that. This is the mask all the way opaque, or all the way transparent, and this is the mask all the way opaque at 100%. So I might drag that back just a little bit. And I don't really like the color of that, so I'm actually going to put a texture on top of the text. So I will go to File, Place Linked. I will grab a texture, and not every texture is the right texture, and sometimes you have to play with it, but this one I'm just going to see what that looks like. Now this I just dropped right in here. I'm going to go over here to the layer where the texture is, right click on it, and hit Create Clipping Mask. And what that does is it clips it right to my words. So I can move this layer around with the Move tool to get where I would like that to be. And I think that looks pretty good. See, it adds more weight to it. And I don't actually like how flat that is. And there's a trick that you can do. I'm going to grab this group and also the texture on top of it, because that's clipping masks and I don't want it to unclip. I'm going to drag those down to the New Layer button to duplicate them. I'm going to turn off visibility on the texture and turn off the outer glow effect so that it's not making my shadows too big. And I'll double click on the effects to bring up the layer style menu. And what I want to do here is go into bevel and emboss. And I'm really going to zoom in here so you see what I'm doing. Oops, I need to go back in. Alright, in bevel and emboss, this puts this nice line around here, and you can play with this with the size. Right now it's on smooth and I'd like it to chisel hard, and that creates this nice chiseled effect. And you can also play with the depth. And I'll hit OK. So that creates this nice chiseled effect. Now, if I take that and set the fill to 0, it actually creates this chiseled effect on top of the layer that already had the texture. Setting the fill to 0 just basically means that the layer styles are still there, but any color like the white that their text originally was is now completely transparent. So, and there's a lot you can do with this too. You can add different colors on top of this. Like I'm going to add a solid color layer, create clippy mask down over top of where it had the texture, add a color to that, and then hit overlay. Or there's different color. I can move it above or below. I can actually have that as the color and set the texture to overlay. There's many different things you can do with this. That's actually a little strong. But there's many things you can do with this. Just playing around, and clipping masks are a really great tool to get your texture and color on your text. And of course you can just go into the text itself and create color too. I don't necessarily want an orange color here, but I often like to put the color and layer effects on the text itself, just so I can control that a little more without having to go into each individual color there. So, oops. So we have our title, and we have our author name, and I'm not going to go into changing that. Actually, what I will show you is if you made the drop shadow down here, and you also want to put a drop shadow up here, or not a drop shadow, outer glow, you don't have to do it again. You can right click on the layer, click copy layer styles, and then I'll go up here to my author name layer, click paste layer styles, and then it automatically puts the outer glow that I had below. And it's a little strong here, so I'll just go in and pull it back a little bit. So there's other effects that you can do with brushes. A lot of times I like to add subtle layer lens flare to the text. And I have lens flare brushes, which you can find them for free. Sometimes they may or may not be for commercial use, so you have to be a little careful about that. But a good place to look are Ron's brushes on daz3d.com, and also graphicriver.net has some great brushes. So I'm going to choose a lens flare brush here, and I'm just going to make it big enough and make sure my opacity is all the way up. And on a new layer on top of all the text, I'm just going to make this flare. And right now it just kind of looks like a generic flare. But what I'm going to do is put this over the text and set it to overlay. And it creates just this subtle lightening effect that just adds a little bit of extra something to the text. So, and you can also add very subtle flares, and I really hesitate to add too much because you can go overboard in a hurry. But you can add very, very subtle flares to things like the sword here. Whoops. I often just put the brush down if it's a stamp brush, and then I'll just move it to where I'd like it to be, and I'll set it to overlay, and then just really knock that back. And I'm not even sure I actually like that there. It's a little bit strong. But you can actually create really nice flare effects with lighting just by kind of moving flares in and around. I'm going to create a subtle flare there, just to kind of add a little bit more light right there. So these are a lot of tricks that you can pull together in a hurry to take. Here's my very base photo that we started with. That's what we started with, and that's how we ended up. And I mean, there's a lot more you can do with this. You can add in more effects. You can add in, sparks and fire and snow or whatever you would like to add in. But just for very, very basic. And you can even layer in more textures as well. Just make sure that you have the textures under the text. That's usually better. So sometimes even adding a little bit more texture. Let's see, I don't really care for that. But yeah, you just experiment as you go, and with some tricks up your sleeve, you'll really, really pull together a nice cover just with a single photo without even having to cut anything out at all. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and thank you for watching.